Hello, hello, and welcome back for the very last chapter of this semester on psychological disorders. Um, this is really where it all comes full circle, kind of like in Psych 1. We talk about the building blocks of the nervous system, neurons and communication and neurotransmitters. We talked about how information flows in your body normally to be able to hear, to see, touch, perceive how it works in learning and memory. And now we come to the last chapter, which is on what happens if these processes are not right. Your neurotransmitter levels are not where they should be, damage to the brain, or genetic correlates. And what we see are um, when your brain is not at 100% capacity, we may have some deficits that result in a diagnosable psychological disorder. So, in this chapter, we will talk about what a psychological disorder is, and we will concentrate on this lecture on schizophrenia. And then for the last lecture, we will go over the affective disorders, which is basically depression and bipolar, as well as some of the anxiety disorders, and we'll talk about genetic correlates. In this um, box, in this page, I have also shared some videos that I would normally show in class, and maybe more than I would show in class, actually, because we have the time now, and some links to look at what the clinical symptoms are for these things like generalized anxiety disorder and depression and things like that. So you can look for those in the page with these lectures on them. Moving right along, what we know is that when the CDC or the APA or one of those companies, one of those US companies, um, gives a survey on mental health diagnoses in this country, we see different numbers. We see depression may be around 9.5 to 10%, schizophrenia about 1%. And when you look at those numbers, what do they mean? Well, one of the things that the first things that they ask in these surveys for people to take is, have you experienced any of these symptoms or have been diagnosed with one of these things in the past 12 months, so in the past calendar year? So if you took it today, you would ask the question, since last May 21st or so, have you been diagnosed with this? So those epidemiological numbers, those numbers that show up that say this percentage of the population has this diagnosis, that's within just the past 12 months. And so what we find is in the past 12 months, just being diagnosed from any of these psychological disorders, not necessarily any specific one, but any of them, is about 1 in 4 US citizens. 25%, we usually don't look at the children as much as we look at the information from adults who are mostly filling out these surveys. So what we see is 25% of adults in the US within a given year suffer from a diagnosable mental illness. 1/4 of the population. If you push that up to ask if anybody has ever been diagnosed over their lifetime, that number goes all the way up to 46%. Almost 46% of people tend to be diagnosed at least once in their lifetime. I actually would have been diagnosed shortly after my grandmother passed away. Normally, there is a period of what they call bereavement, which is only supposed to last about a couple weeks after a person passes away. But if you still have these depressed feelings for longer, they didn't used to have a diagnosis, but now in a newer version of this DSM, they mark it as a extended or elongated bereavement period. So, yeah, almost 50% of people within their lifetime will have one diagnosable mental illness potentially. And the cost, of course, of the mental health field for all of this is over 300 billion per year in the U.S. Right, so it's a very lucrative, a very costly type of thing. And, we don't even have a system that deals with mental health as well as it does physical health. So that number may be not even as high as it could be, right? So looking at the specific types, we're not here in Psych 1, we talked about what constitutes a diagnosis, what's the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. Obviously, you guys have all had Psych 1, so we're just going to go into the disorders themselves. We'll go through schizophrenia here, and then in the next one, I will talk about mood disorders and anxiety disorders. So first of all, one of the things that I asked you guys for your final um, extra credit paper, should you choose to do it, is that I wanted you to review a movie that centered around some sort of psychological phenomenon, whether it was the main character or some crazy twist at the end. And one of the things that I asked for, and in fact was the online version of this class, was does a discussion every module, and their discussion revolves around the media. And it's because when I was younger, I used to think that schizophrenia, which literally translates in German to split mind, was the same as split personalities, or what now we know as dissociative identity disorder. And the reason for that was because there were a lot of movies that I couldn't tell the difference. And even in the definition, split mind makes it sound like you're two different personalities, which it is not. I watched a movie in the early 90s called What About Bob? And there was a famous line, at least to me, from that movie where he says, "Roses are red, violets are blue. I'm a schizophrenic and so am I." He wasn't actually schizophrenic in this movie. He had a lot of problems. Schizophrenia was not one of them. But it was easy to see how, 12 or 13-year-old me could be, without any knowledge of psychology, would say, oh, those must be the same thing, right? So that's sort of the idea behind that. Did the movie do a good job, bad job, or TV show or whatever it is in portraying this illness as it is in real life? Or were they just doing it for entertainment purposes or to win Best Picture? So in the videos that I gave you guys to look at, the first one is Schizophrenia Portrayed in a Beautiful Mind, Best Picture. And it was based on a true story of a man named John Nash that had schizophrenia. He was a brilliant mind, mathematician, and he just tried to beat it by trying to out-reason it, which you can't do, obviously. But one of the things they showed in the movie is that he was able to isolate what he knew were hallucinations or, figments of his imagination and say, I'm just going to ignore you for most of my life, which sounds all great, and maybe if you have such a beautiful, brilliant mind, you can figure out what's real and what's not. But in all reality, that would be super hard to do, no matter how brilliant your mind is. And then I gave you 3 clips of a movie called The Soloist, which in my opinion does the best job I've ever seen in portraying somebody with schizophrenia. So Jamie Foxx is amazing in this movie, and you can really hear in his voice the way he talks, the disorganization, as we'll talk about in this disorder. You can there's another clip where he has voices in his head and he tries to run from them. And of course, no matter how much you run, you can't run from your own brain. So it's very different from how it was portrayed in A Beautiful Mind. And in my opinion, this was the best job I've ever seen of a movie dealing with a schizophrenic person. I even gave you a clip of I'm not schizophrenic, and you can see sort of a violent tendency he goes into, part of the sort of positive symptoms of schizophrenia. So again, the biggest symptom, there are actually 3 main clusters of symptoms in schizophrenia I will go over: the positive, the negative, and the cognitive deficits. The most prevalent one, and potentially the most dangerous one, is the psychosis, which is characterized by perceptual, emotional, and intellectual deficits, definite loss of contact with reality. So unlike the movie with Nash, they're not most schizophrenic patients, if not all, are not able to figure out what's real and what's fake from their brain because it all feels real. And of course, the biggest thing of any psychological disorder is the inability to function in normal everyday life. Remember that this is not dissociative identity disorder, which is the newer definition or newer label for multiple personalities. Um, it is not the same thing. The movie Split, um, the M. Night Shyamalan movie, that one is about dissociative identity disorder. A lot of people like to do their final extra credit paper on Split. So not the same thing as schizophrenia. So looking at the history of psychological disorders, one of the things that we know is over time, people used to treat them really badly. Sometimes that still happens in society today. Because these people were disruptive in normal everyday life, back in the late 1800s, 17, 1800s, they would be chained or locked away in asylums. Here is a man named Philippe Pinel that's actually freeing mental patients from chains because he did not believe in chaining them to the walls or to buildings or sticking them in asylums. And even in doctor's offices before the times of Sigmund Freud, if you were to go into a doctor's office in the 1800s and say, I'm not feeling well, the doctor would say, well, what are your symptoms? And you say, well, I'm feeling kind of depressed or blue or down or anxious or something like that. And they would say, okay, well, what about physical pain, like from your body? And you say, no, 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 physically I'm fine. I just have problems concentrating and I feel down in the dumps. And doctor would say, without a medical diagnosis, get out of here. We don't want this. So it wasn't even until Sigmund Freud came along that mental health was even seen as separate from physical health. Before that, people were thought to be either a witch and burned at the stake, literally, or they were thought to be possessed by some sort of evil spirit or demon. And a lot of times, the cure or the treatment was to drill holes in the skull so that the evil spirits could escape, because apparently they were not able to escape and had taken over your mind and body. So thankfully, in the last 120 years or so, we have come a long way from that, but with some things it's harder than others. With schizophrenia, it's really hard because why did that not advance? In schizophrenia, we have three different clusters of symptoms that encompass three different um, neurotransmitter systems, which means three different types of medication that may or may not work together. So before we go over that, let's look at the demographics, right? The epidemiology, sometimes it's called. So schizophrenia within the last year or so, or over lifetimes really, it occurs in about 1% of the population. Men and women seem to be about equal in the diagnoses, as opposed to like mood disorders. But men seem to show symptoms first during, at sort of at a younger age, sort of during the mid-teens or early 20s, and women is usually about a decade later, so about the mid-20s to 30s. In the US, it's about 1 in every 100 people, so about 1%, and we seem to see that this worldwide, for those countries that report it, is about the same. It's about 1% in the US and worldwide. There used to be different names for the different types of schizophrenia in older versions of what's called the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health. There used to be paranoid schizophrenia, where you would think that your delusions and paranoia would be that somebody was out to hurt you or read your thoughts or something, and you were very paranoid all the time. There was a catatonic schizophrenia, where somebody was almost in a coma-like or trance-like state when these episodes would happen. But now we just refer to them as acute and chronic symptoms. And acute, not like, oh, that's such acute schizophrenia. No, in acute, those are ones that almost kind of like panic attacks, that they just sort of develop out of nowhere. and they're not very common. Like, you don't see the symptoms in everyday life. You only see it when these attacks sort of flare up. So in this case, the acute symptoms develop suddenly, and these acute ones may develop earlier than teenage years. So the acute one tends to show up earlier, but it's much more responsive to treatment because, kind of like an anxiety attack or a panic attack, you only need to take medication when it develops. The time in between these episodes are called recovery periods. So sometimes it could be months or even years between recovery periods. And so the prognosis is reasonably good because you don't have to take a lot of medication. You only really need to do it when there's a flare up, when there is an attack of these symptoms. So it's much more responsive to treatment. The prognosis is reasonably good, and the time for recovery periods is, usually pretty spread out. It's the chronic symptoms that are really the worst. In the chronic symptoms, they develop gradually and they persist for a very long time. And of course, based on some of the things we talked about with therapeutic windows, and if you continually have to take drugs every day, all the time, medications for this, your body develops tolerance to them. So the recovery periods get shorter and shorter as you get older. Symptoms continue to get worse because the medication doesn't cure schizophrenia. It can't. All it does is try to control the symptoms. So the prognosis is a lot more poor for those that have chronic symptoms because they have to take medication daily to control these things. So what are some of these symptoms? And apparently there we go. Some of these symptoms, really quickly before we get into the incidence and heritability, let me just check and see. I should know this better than I feel like I do right now, but we are at that point in the semester where I just want to see if I have a slide on it specifically. I don't think I do. So yeah, let's go back. I apologize for that. So really quickly, I'm going to go back to slide 5, and I'm going to let you guys know that there are 3 clusters of symptoms. I guess I'll just stick at 6 because it doesn't want to go back. 3 main clusters of symptoms. So I have labeled this as the big bad wolf of behavioral or psychological disorders because it is huge. The biggest portion of it is genetic. So that's why when you look at these incidences, if you have family members that are schizophrenic, or especially if you're twins, we talked about the importance of twin studies since the very beginning on nature and nurture, your chances of developing it are much higher than the general population. Remember, the general population is about 1%, 1 in every 100 people. If you have a family member who has it, the heritability is between 0.6 and 0.9, 60 and 90%. And so what we see is that if you have a family member like a brother, sister, a parent, or both, even both parents, your chances of getting it are much higher. About a 10% risk if you have a family member that has it. If you have a parent or a brother or sister, it goes up to about 17%. If you have an identical twin as opposed to a fraternal twin, remember 100% DNA versus 50%, those numbers triple. And you have up to a 51% chance if one identical twin has schizophrenia, the chances the other one will have it are about 51%. So again, not 100%, but that's up to 51 times higher than the general population. So again, let me go into the idea of the symptoms of schizophrenia. So you need to have the genetics for it, and one of the other reasons why I call it the big bad wolf is that it could be anywhere from a dozen genes that are working together out of whack to anywhere up to like 150 or more genes that are contributing to this diagnosis. And the problem is we don't know, as many as we can try to figure out our link to it, we really don't know how much it's contributing. So something like a dopamine receptor gene could be contributing up to 50%, and another gene could be contributing 2 or 3%, right? And so we don't know exactly how to do this, and that makes it really hard to learn the pathology, or what we call the pathophysiology, of knowing which parts of the brain, which structures, what they do, and everything that's involved. And then we have these epigenetic factors, which means that one gene can cause another gene to upregulate or downregulate, increase or decrease. It can turn one off, turn another thing off, stop producing this, start producing that. And we have this big domino effect that we call epigenetics. The other thing about schizophrenia is that with all of these genetics, there really seems to be an environmental trigger, at least for the chronic version of schizophrenia. So some sort of thing in the environment, a stressor, a death in the family, being broken up with, maybe even failing a class, losing a job, having to finish school and move home, that can cause this to set in motion. It's kind of like, I kind of liken it to the gears and cogs in a clock and springs. If everything in a clock is working perfectly and under the surface that could appear to be, then everything is fine. But once one spring goes out of whack, for the most part, through college, she had her quirks. Um, she was known to be a little strange, but nothing too out of the ordinary for normal society. Um, She even was very brilliant, straight A student, went to UC Irvine and even lived at the dorms. And when she graduated with almost a 4.0, and graduated with a degree in library science because she really wanted to be a librarian. She loved children's books since she was a child, and things like that. So school came easy to her. There didn't seem to be many problems there. She was isolated from other people, but not anything that you could pinpoint as like super out of the ordinary. And then when it came time to get a job after college, she found that increasingly difficult. With her resume and her grades and everything, she was able to get many, many interviews, but bombed every one of them because she was awkward and came across that way. And eventually she had to move home with her older parents. Um, and this is where the strange behaviors really started. So if we were to pinpoint an environmental trigger, it would have been not being able to get a job and having to move home with your parents. So then they started seeing very weird behavior, like she refused to bathe, wash her hair, shower, um, peeing in jars and keeping them in her room. And as soon as I heard stuff like that, I said, well, I know what this is. You need to, because she probably won't go in on her own, you need to have, call somebody as a family member and have them take her on a psychiatric hold. And it turned out, of course, to be schizophrenia, the chronic version. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about are the symptoms, but I'll get to that in a little bit. Looking again at the risk, if you are adopted by two people that have schizophrenia and your adopted parents are both schizophrenic, but there is no cases of schizophrenia in your biological family, then your chances of getting schizophrenia are basically zero. Even if both people in the environment that adopted you, which would never really happen in reality, but even if they did, you would not have a chance of getting that. Again, it is not an environmental thing. There's an environmental trigger if you have the biological genetics for it. But if not, then you will not develop it. So again, having a spouse that has schizophrenia, but it doesn't run in your family, if you're unrelated to the people biologically, you have a 0% chance. Your risk is 1 to 2% just because of, margin of errors or things like that. 4% chance of getting it because there is some family history. If you have if you are the son or daughter of one person in your one parent that has schizophrenia, again, your chances go up to about 17%. If you have a non-twin sibling, it's about a 9 or 10% chance. Fraternal twin or one parent goes up to about 17%. If you have both parents that have schizophrenia, your chances jump up to about 46%. And as you see, for identical twins, 100% DNA match, that goes from 17%. Here it says 48. The latest one I had was 51%. So if you go from 16% to 48, that's a triple. If you go from 17 to 51%, right, same idea. You're 3 times more likely with an identical twin. And this again shows this idea of nature over nurture when we talk about it. So looking again at the risk, a normal fraternal twin, your risk of schizophrenia in their offspring is relatively low. The schizophrenic fraternal twin goes up to 17%, and then a normal or schizophrenic identical twin about the same. So you see a huge jump in their offspring as well as siblings that are twins, right? The offspring of those twins as well have a very high risk. Really quickly, the symptoms, there are 3 clusters of symptoms, and I apologize for not having this as a slide, but I know that if you go down below to the modules where I have it written out from the online section, that you will see this written out, that there are 3 clusters of symptoms, another reason why it's hard to treat. So we have the positive symptoms, which are the ones you see on TV and in the movies: hallucinations, delusions, hearing voices in your head, seeing people that aren't there, disorganized thoughts, and disorganized speech, as you'll see in the video from Nathaniel, which is played by Jamie Foxx. Sometimes motor behavior that's exaggerated, rigid motor behavior when you move and walk and things like that. Thinking people are out to get you and hurt you, or listening to your thoughts. That's the positive symptoms, and those stem from excessive dopamine. More dopamine receptors in that striatum area that we talked about, the striatum in the last chapter, and before that, part of the basal ganglia. The negative symptoms of schizophrenia, which are antisocial, actually we will be going over this in a couple slides, which is more like depressive symptoms. Those are not dopamine related. Those seem to be maybe serotonin related, kind of like depression. And then we have the third type of symptom, third cluster of symptom, which are cognitive deficits. And what that means is you have problems in your normal learning and memory, thinking, remembering, keeping your attention on things. So you'll do poorly in tasks of concentration, attention, memory, right? Things like that. And that seems to be a glutamate problem more than anything. So there's not going to be any one pill that's going to handle the dopamine system, the serotonin system, and the glutamate system all at the same time. We have to treat the cluster separately. For the positive symptoms, where there's too much dopamine in the striatum, you need dopamine antagonists, and that's what antipsychotics are. For the cognitive problems, it seems to be a lack of glutamate, so you want something that would be a glutamate agonist of sorts to help regulate that. And there's an interaction between dopamine and glutamate, so would you even be able to take both of those at the same time? It's hard to say. Antidepressants a lot of times are prescribed to go with the negative symptoms. Will that interact with all the other medications, right? And do we prioritize one over the others? Well, the positive symptoms are the ones that tend to be the worst, cause violent outbursts, right? These whole hallucinations and delusions. So those are probably the priority, and they always have been since the 1950s, since Thorazine first came out, since antipsychotics were first introduced to the market. So this is why we talk about it being the big bad wolf. Now let's look at some of the models of schizophrenia that we've seen based on the brain abnormalities. So one of the things that I just talked about is that in normal chronic schizophrenia, we usually don't see the symptoms until until adolescence, until after puberty is hit. And one of the theories behind that is the fact that, as we talked about in chapter 3, we lose a lot of we have all those extra neurons and synapses as this nervous system is being developed and the brain is being developed, in order to ensure that we have a backup plan in case some of these neurons fail. But in that fourth sort of stage, remember we had um, migration, proliferation, right? Proliferation, migration, circuit formation, and then we had circuit pruning, which was the last one. Well, that pruning seems to take place during adolescence, and that's when all the extra synapses that are no longer necessary or aren't really being used get flushed out. And so what that may do is cause the neurons, if you do have the genetics for schizophrenia, to now become vulnerable. They're not hidden, right? You're pruning away all the extra synapses, so now they're exposed, right? So this vulnerability model says maybe that there's some threshold of causal forces that must be exceeded in order for the illness to occur. And when you have those extra neurons, and maybe you're younger and you don't have as many stressors, because you're not an adult yet and you don't have all these adult challenges, that it's sort of hidden, right? So there may be some threshold of forces that have to be exceeded, something that pushes you over the edge, that pushes you over the threshold, right? Just kind of like how the action potential, once it goes above threshold, it's an all or none process. So here, environmental challenges combine with the genetic vulnerability. Now, after adolescence, you have that pruning that's taken place, so your neurons are exposed and maybe the genetics are a little more exposed. And as soon as something happens, some trigger, you lose a job, you have to move home and can't get a job, you fail a class, somebody breaks up with you, somebody dies, your dog runs away, right? Something like that, just that increases the stress level, and boom, it just pushes the causal forces above that threshold, and like the action potential, it just everything goes out of whack, right? The clock stops working, the spring has sprung, and in that case, right, that's where things go downhill. And once those genes go out of whack with those epigenetic effects, and that domino effect, then these epigenetic means upregulating, downregulating other genes, turning some on, turning some off. Things start producing or stop producing. Everything has started. And once that happens, it's like a switch has been flipped. Once the switch is flipped, that's it. If you have the chronic version of schizophrenia, once those genes go into motion, that's it. They don't come back from that. So we can't cure it. We can only try to help contain it with certain medications and things like that. So that's the idea behind the vulnerability model. Wow, these slides don't really want to continue. Come on, please. Why are you not working? Oh, now it goes too far. Okay, so let's do this. And oh, weird. Okay. There we go. Going back to it because it's not working on its own so much. Let's go here. Oops. There we go. Let's try again in presentation mode. Let's hope this works. I don't know why it's being a brat today. So the two main symptoms that people looked at before the cognitive problems, which is a third type, are the positive and negative symptoms. And here is where the problem lies, right? Looking at the characteristic symptoms of the type 1 or positive symptoms of schizophrenia are these delusions and hallucinations, thinking that you're king or queen of the world, thinking that there are people out to get you, maybe making imaginary friends, hearing voices in your head, right? They are very different from the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, which is poverty of speech, lack of affect, almost depressive-like in your symptoms, isolation, inappropriate emotional output. So when something is very sad, you're laughing. When something is happy, you're showing the wrong expression, and things like that. And that is very different. In the cognitive symptoms, which is the third type, the cognitive problems, you have problems with attention, memory, learning, um, keeping focus, right? Things like that. So that's different from both of these. But looking at just the positive and negative symptoms, when we look at the treatments, um, too many receptors, too many dopamine receptors, too much dopamine flow into that striatum is the cause for the positive symptoms. So when you give anti-dopaminergic drugs or dopamine antagonists, um, they have a good response to those. The negative symptoms don't have to do with dopamine output. It's most likely due to a serotonin type of thing, and so they're not going to respond to the anti-dopaminergic drugs. These dopamine antagonists will do well to hold off the positive symptoms, but do nothing for the negative symptoms. Um, Looking at the outcome of using these drugs, these symptoms are potentially reversible while you're taking the drug, but not necessarily if you stop taking it. And are the negative symptoms irreversible? We're not really sure on that one. You may be able to help them with like an antidepressant, but again, you have to make sure that if you're taking an antidepressant and an antipsychotic, that there's not a problem with those two together, right? Because that can cause a lot of problems. Do we see any intellectual impairments in type 1? No, we don't. In type 2, we do see sometimes intellectual impairments. Of course, in the cognitive problems, you definitely see those intellectual impairments, and that's glutamate. That's a third neurotransmitter system that is affected here. And again, anti-dopaminergic drugs or dopamine antagonists not going to help with the cognitive problems. Um, we need something that's going to increase glutamate. As we talked about, glutamate in the last chapter is um, obviously is the main neurotransmitter involved in learning and memory. We also talked about acetylcholine, but that doesn't seem to be the same as what we would see in an Alzheimer's patient. So the suggested pathology of this is for the positive symptoms, there are more dopamine D2 receptors in the striatum than there should be, and that causes more dopamine to be taken up, and that excess dopamine, as we talked about, is what leads to these positive symptoms. Here, for the negative symptoms, it could be serotonin related, or it could be sometimes with schizophrenia. As part of the diagnosis, we see loss of cells in the hippocampus and temporal lobe areas, as well as dysfunction in the frontal lobes. So as for type 1, there may be increased dopamine in the striatum. In the frontal lobe, we see decreased levels of dopamine and schizophrenia and things like that. And cell loss in the hippocampus and temporal lobe area may have to do with poor connectivity with the frontal lobes, right? That puts everything together and processes everything. So even though you may see a lot of these symptoms together, what's causing the different clusters of symptoms are different neurotransmitter systems, and therefore we need a different type of medication to control those. And could they all work together? Maybe, possibly, but probably not. Nope, it's still being stubborn, but here we go. So for about 40 to 50 years, we didn't know much about the type 2 or type 3 symptoms. We only dealt with, of course, the worst of them. So the biggest hypothesis for over 40 years with schizophrenia was the dopamine hypothesis that said, look, these are the symptoms that are the worst. These are the ones that need to be treated. So too much dopamine in the brain, we see higher activity in the and the side effects of the L-DOPA made them have some of these psychotic breakdowns. Anti-dopaminergic drugs, dopamine antagonists, if you're taking too high a dose, some of the side effects might be Parkinsonian problems with motor movement, right? So that's what we call tardive dyskinesia. Anti-dopamine drugs do help a lot of people with schizophrenia, but sometimes there's a good proportion of them that don't help. Um, so looking at the first type of antipsychotics, the first generation ones that came out were discovered accidentally in the 50s. Though they were effective, they seemed to produce problems with motor movements because, again, um, the opposite of, in this case, in the striatum, the opposite of too much dopamine is not enough, and that causes Parkinson's-like side effects. So now we have atypical antipsychotics that it seems to be the D2 version of the dopamine receptor that is the most likely target. So these specific antipsychotics target just the D2 receptors, and they target them less than the original ones, so we see less side effects. So this seems to be equal to or more effective than just a regular generic antidopaminergic drugs, and sometimes they can help resistant cases through action on serotonin. Remember that serotonin is the ringleader. The nice thing about that is that there may be promise for the future if we can get dopamine and serotonin to sort of fall in line with one another. Then we may be able to get a nice balance between the positive and negative symptoms. The problem with this, although in some cases, is that we want dopamine to decrease. At the same time, we want serotonin to increase, because remember, and we'll talk about in the mood disorders, it's a lack of serotonin and too much dopamine. So we'd have to get the right mix of agonist and antagonist to be able to have that work in the future. That is probably the hardest part these days of trying to get that. One miracle drug that can control two or even all three of the symptoms, good luck, right? That's what we've been working on for years. So here, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is just looking at the relationship between certain receptor blocking of certain medications and the clinical effectiveness. At the very bottom, you need a lower dose of spiroperidol. At the top, you see chlorpromazine, clozapine. Promazine, you need a much higher dose. Haloperidol is somewhere in the middle. These are just antagonists that block those D2 receptors and how effective they can be based on doses. Obviously, the higher the dose, the more your body and brain become tolerant to the effects, and that might be worse. So that's why maybe a spiroperidol, where you're taking less dosage of the medication, may be better over time. Less, at least in the short term, less tolerance develops and things like that. But you can see that there have been many of these drugs that have been developed to try to help with mixed results. So there is also a glutamate theory, which is much more recent, from the 1990s. I am very proud to say that my advisor, when I was at UCLA, he's now teaching in upstate New York, like in Buffalo. But when he was a grad student, it was him and his advisor that actually saw that PCP, they discovered that PCP mimics schizophrenia by what it does with the NMDA receptors. We talked about the NMDA receptors in learning and memory in chapter 12, and how the NMDA receptor specifically was involved in LTP, which produced long-lasting learning and memory, right? The physical proof, neural proof of learning and memory in the brain. So one thing we see in schizophrenic patients as well, which is actually what I looked at in my research for my dissertation, is in addition to too much dopamine, we have too little glutamate. And when you don't have enough glutamate, that's what's causing problems in learning, retaining memory, keeping attention and focus, being able to switch from one task to another. And one of the things that people noticed is that PCP, which is called phencyclidine or angel dust, it was one of those in chapter 5. We talked about it as one of those hallucinogens, actually. A bit of a stimulant, but more of a hallucinogen, that it mimics the effects of schizophrenia. So people that were high on angel dust and PCP claim to have the same symptoms as people who are having a positive episode, right? Hallucinations, delusions, and things like that. So my advisor and his advisor at the time, his advisor in grad school at Yale, were looking at the mechanisms of action, and they noticed that when you inhibit an NMDA, that's what PCP does. It basically functionally causes glutamate to increase. I'm sorry, dopamine to increase, and so that could lead to some of the positive symptoms of schizophrenia and some of the cognitive ones. So maybe cognitive deficits and positive symptoms can be looked at together. One of the things that I tried to do is increasing glutamate through administration of that other neurotransmitter, glycine, the other less known excitatory neurotransmitter. So what I did was I tried to use a glycine transport inhibitor. So just to remind you, the transporter is on the presynaptic side. That's what detects the amount of neurotransmitter and also is responsible for reuptake. So I basically tried to prevent reuptake of glycine and hope that that would regulate glutamate levels, but I couldn't get my medication to dissolve into saline, so I couldn't inject it into the mice. So what I ended up actually trying to do was inject them with PCP to give them a behavioral schizophrenic episode, because again, it mimics the effects of schizophrenia. So we could use it behaviorally in mice to be able to watch them wig out. And then I was hoping to use this other medication to rescue the deficits. So I would give them deficits, and then I would try to take the deficits away that PCP caused and basically counteract the PCP. I couldn't do it. That's why I'm not working for a pharmaceutical company, and that's why I don't have a lot more money right now. I would still prefer to teach here, but I would be doing so with a lot more money because I would have helped to develop a drug for this. That would have been nice. So glutamate and dopamine seem to have an interaction, so there may be a future in maybe helping to fix some of the cognitive problems as well as some of the psychotic episodes. Looking at the brain abnormalities, obviously we see problems in the striatum. We see problems with cell loss because cells die out. Instead of being in nice columns and rows, sometimes they're tangled. So we get a lot of disconnectivity or asynchronous activity between the frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus. So looking at patients with schizophrenia in brain scans, we see reduced gray matter, reduced areas of the limbic system, which includes the hippocampus and amygdala. Sometimes if it's around the ventricles, of course, that results in increased ventricular size. So more cerebral spinal fluid, less brain material, that could be problematic. So where we see problems in thinking, of course, has to do with thinking, remembering, learning, following patterns, has to do with the frontal lobe and putting all that information together. So when the frontal lobe is working at a reduced capacity, we call it hypofrontality. Hypo meaning less, right, than normal. So it's running lower than normal. Hypofrontality is indicated by brain scans, and one of the tests that we give for this is called the Wisconsin card sort test. So in the Wisconsin card sort test, you have to figure out the pattern. There are cards, and I will give you a link for this one as well. I haven't added it yet. But there are cards that are similar in either the number of things, the shape of the things, or the color of the things. So the cards could be either yellow, green, red, or blue. The cards can either have plus signs, stars, triangles, or circles, and they either have 1, 2, 3, or 4 of them. And you have to figure out what the pattern is. It's either sorted by color, it's sorted by shape, or it's sorted by the number of stimuli on the card. And once you figure out the pattern, after 10 times in a row, the pattern switches. So you have to be able to know that the pattern is no longer the same, and then you have to figure out what the new pattern is by asking, and the person can give you yes or no answers. People with Alzheimer's, of course, have problems with this, being able to switch from one to the other. And people with schizophrenia have a lot of problems keeping their attention, sticking with it, figuring out when the pattern switches. And this seems to be due to disrupted communication, right? We talked about this in working memory where the hippocampus and frontal lobe are working together, hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. So there seems to be a miscommunication or asynchronous activity between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. You can see that not only is it less neurotransmitter activity, but it seems to be interrupted and less blood flow. Remember during this card sorting test, you can put them in a PET scan, or in this case, in an fMRI, and you will see that activity that is increasing is going to be more of a yellow or red color, like you see on the top normal patient during the Wisconsin card sort test. Left prefrontal cortex, right prefrontal cortex. This is called the dorsolateral, or DLPFC, which is where this attention switching and task switching, pattern switching seems to be processed. So in the normal patient, you see a lot of yellow and even some red in the right prefrontal cortex. But looking at the patient that's schizophrenic, you see a lot of blue and purple, which indicates less activity in that area. So it makes it much harder to be able to continue to pay attention to the card sort task or to figure out when a pattern changed and what the new pattern is. You just seem to get really confused, right? Looking at the connectivity and synchronicity between neurons and parts of the brain, here we see decreased activity and decreased connections. And this comes from not only reduced cells and reduced gray matter, but if the cell's dead, so is the axon. So we see reduced white matter as well. So maybe the corpus callosum and other white matter pathways are not as efficient because the cells die. And we see this especially in the temporal lobe when it comes to auditory gating. This is where most of the hallucinations are actually auditory hallucinations, so hearing voices as opposed to seeing somebody there or something like that. And that has to be due to the fact that there is a miscommunication in the auditory system. So you're hearing things that you shouldn't be hearing, and there's input there that shouldn't be there, whether it's not gated properly, whether there's just too much extra sound. Remember, we talked about with hallucinogens, the reason we trip out and hear things or see things is because our sensory neurons are giving extra input. In this case, that's what's happening in the auditory system. There's extra input, so we're hearing things that aren't actually there. One of the interesting things about this is that a lot of times, of course, if medication isn't so responsive, that people try other things to self-medicate. Marijuana, of course, is a huge one, and we've talked about the benefits of marijuana for a lot of things, but schizophrenia seems to be, some of those symptoms seem to be controlled a little better with marijuana, but nicotine is actually one that's really seems to work really well. A lot of people that are schizophrenic are smokers because the nicotine actually helps to maintain some of the symptoms. So it seems to normalize the auditory gating for some reason, and maybe reduce the amount of voices heard, and seems to improve the negative symptoms, which are the antisocial behavior, depressive-like symptoms, and things like that. So there was a study, probably about 10 years ago that said about 80% of people with schizophrenia tend to smoke because it helps their symptoms. Looking at the genetic correlates for this, we see that there's a gene for the acetylcholine nicotinic receptor that's implicated in this reduced activity and implicated in reduction of symptoms. So people are encouraged to smoke. It's actually, nicotine works for reducing anxiety, as you people that smoke probably know. When they get anxious, smoke a cigarette and it sort of calms them down a little bit, relaxes the muscles a little bit. In Europe, actually, currently for the coronavirus, a lot of people were saying that nicotine may help to prevent against the coronavirus as well. So it's just interesting that we see some of these similarities here. Looking at knowing that it's 90% genetic or more, that you have to have the genetic underpinnings, but that there's an environmental trigger. Looking at environmental origins and neurotransmitter anomalies, we can see that some of the things that may increase it are head trauma, during early years, which also includes complications from birth, prenatal complications like stress um, to the mother, stress to the actual person, immune responses, starvation during pregnancy, which results in low birth weight. Sometimes the umbilical cord can get stuck around the baby's head and neck, which can cause a reduction and lack of airflow when they first come out. That could be very problematic. We call that hypoxia. Um, one of my neighbors the other day talked about the lack of oxygen to one of his grandchildren. He's an older gentleman, and he was saying that they called it a blue baby, and I'm guessing because the face turns blue with lack of oxygen. I'd never actually heard the term blue baby, but I knew exactly what he was talking about right away. So I'm like, hey, I can incorporate that into today's lecture. So we see a lot of these things that can exacerbate or make the symptoms worse, make them show up earlier than adolescence, right? And things like that. One of the other things that we've seen, you kind of have to take it into with a grain of salt, is this thing that we call the winter birth effect. One of the things that had been shown to be very highly correlated with children that developed schizophrenia was moms that had flu, that developed influenza, the flu, during their second trimester. And this was definitely seen more when the second trimester was around the late summer and fall, because their birth would be in the winter. So this was called the winter birth effect. If you look down here, looking at the average schizophrenic births, during high influenza years, you see a lot of that, especially when the second trimester fell around here, because you would see the births during the winter when there was a lot of cold and famine and everything. And so I say you have to take it with a grain of salt, because this was a lot during the 1940s and 50s and 60s, way before, you know, technology was better and centralized heating and air conditioning in most developed countries came along. So would we see this winter effect nowadays? Maybe in some of the less developed countries, third world type countries, but probably not in the US. So that's why you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. Again, looking at these epidemics, we see 1939 to 1960 up here. So although we may still see traces of that in other countries, you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt today, for the US at least, and for England, some of the more developed countries. So again, this is basically showing the same thing. Direct damage to the brain, possible problems early on. You may be able to detect quirky, crazy behaviors coming from these brain abnormalities, but again, the brain is kind of protected by those extra neurons, and it's not until you kind of go through that idea of synaptic pruning where it leaves the genes and the neurons sort of, and the brain more vulnerable to some sort of environmental trigger. We also see, in addition to the winter birth effect, some of these neurodevelopmental problems during neuron migration. So there is a hormone or a chemical in the brain called relin, which is helping migrate these neurons to where they're supposed to be. So one of the things that I talked about with this asynchronous is that you know, these neurons are supposed to be developed in nice columns and rows, and what we find is some of them may go too far, some of them not far enough, kind of like during if the mom is drinking during pregnancy, right? We see this similarity of the not nice columns and rows, so we get a lot of traffic and gridlock and problems with synchronous connections between neurons. That's pretty much it for schizophrenia. Oh yeah, there's a couple more. So you can see here those asynchronous neurons, if they can't communicate well, those connections may drop and those neurons may die off. So what we see in gray matter is, in normal adolescence, you see a lot of regular gray matter, and then looking at the color changes in a schizophrenic subject, when you get into the green, yellow, red, and even the sort of lighter lavender, purplish, pinkish, is average loss of cells. So you see up at the top in the frontal parietal lobes, on the temporal lobes on the side, you see a lot of red, which is indicating somewhere between 3 and 4% of loss of gray matter, right? So you're losing a lot of neurons. They're not in sync. And so you can see a lot of problems that develop. You can see where this would cause problems in proper gating of the auditory system, resulting in hallucinations. You can see in the learning and memory centers of the brain that they'll have problems concentrating, learning, remembering things, right? And all of that. That was the last slide. When we come back, we will have one more lecture on the affective disorders such as depression and bipolar disorder, as well as some of the anxiety disorders and some of the genetic components of those. I hope you enjoyed the schizophrenia chapter. I always find it infinitely interesting, so I hope that it comes across that way when I give my lecture. And as always, I'll talk to you soon.